Hi, and welcome to RAN in Focus, a podcast brought to you by the Radicalization Awareness Network.
Today we'll be talking to experts about the so-called Incel movement and why it's come onto the radar of so many practitioners across Europe.
It's quite an interesting topic, incels, the Incel movement. Incel stands for involuntary celibates. So this is a very male-dominated world. Based around the ideas that culture is to blame and other men are to blame for these guys not getting a girl or a girlfriend.
This is also a really strong hatred of women as well, which is obviously for me quite a personal thing. But there's been at least 6 mass murders, resulting in a total of about 44 deaths that have been committed since 2014. By men who have either self-identified as incels or who have mentioned incel-related names, which is obviously very, very, very worrying and something that it's a massive growing community online as well. And their online communities are what are very important and very relevant to this discussion.
So today we're chatting with 3 experts, and they are going to give us the insights into the violent incel movement. And hopefully they can give us some advice as well as practitioners.
Our first contributor today is Christian Morgensen from the Center for Digital Youth Care in Aarhus in Denmark. He is an expert in specializing in social media, and he is here to give us some insight into the incel movement. Hi, Christian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to, at least digitally be here.
So there's obviously a lot to unpack here. Maybe we can just take a step back and kind of look at the history of incels and how it kind of developed into what it is now.
Like the notoriety of the term incel spiked after the Santa Barbara attacks in the US. Like that is what I want to call the onset of modern supremacist incel views, or a lot of these users that have been hovering around this idea of men in the face of women as the opposition, sexual supremacy, and so on and so forth, finally found one cause that had this is what we mean, this is exactly what we want to do, like he is our hero.
They're very much caught in that really peculiar kind of position of, extreme self-hatred, but also thinking that they're kind of better than everyone else. But what would you say inceldom is an expression of? Would it be like extreme hatred, or is it kind of like an extreme cry for help?
A lot of the men that I've interviewed have started by prefacing their narrative of saying, like, I'm going to tell you how angry I am. I'm going to give you all the reasons as to why I'm angry. And I'm going to red pill you into also becoming angry at evil feminists and so on and so forth. And then they've started by saying, I never had any friends. I think for a lot of the people who consider themselves to be incels, the hatred of others is a psychological defense mechanism because self-hatred is self-destructive.
Maybe that also goes back to education, the way you're raised, the way society looks at the role of men. So very fundamental issues that are beneath that, but also for me that really explains why these guys look for an outlet. Maybe gaming could be an outlet, but also like an incel movement can tap into those grievances and really empower them to do something with those emotions that they're feeling.
Part of what is scary or concerning about the incel movements and some of the other manospheric movements is that we do know that there are some men behind the curtains, like pulling strings and weaponizing these emotions with these men and targeting this mistranslated anger into directions of what I call proactive activism, like fighting against women, not just being against feminism, but being against women's rights in the first place. They will have specific scientific papers that they will quote internally, like it's usually called black pill science that points to the fact that your life is fatalistic, you have no impact on life or society, you're just deemed to a life of utter hopelessness.
But what I'm kind of hearing are, all these terms about, red pill, black pill, all of this stuff. Can you maybe open that up a little bit more?
There is a lot of colorful language in the incel and manospheric movements. Something that is in all of them is this notion of pills, like the blue pill into the red pill into the black pill. Everybody should have seen The Matrix. Like, it's the best movie ever made. It's an awesome movie. But there's this very iconic scene where Morpheus offers Neo a blue pill, and he can take this blue pill. He can wake up in the fake world, and he can just be content with life. Like, this is the easy solution. Or he can take the red pill. And if he takes the red pill, he wakes up and he sees the world how it really is, meaning that he has a responsibility, but also the power to fight back against this unequal mess that is the actual world. Neo, of course, takes the red pill, and that cues in like the next couple of action scenes. This imagery of opening your eyes or acknowledging the world how it really is very strong in the incel ideology. Once you understand how evil the opposition, women or sexually successful men, are, then you need to fight back. Then you're called to fight back against them. Once you've tried that, at some point you need to take the black pill. The black pill is fatalism, nihilism, the acknowledgement that no matter what you do, it's not going to matter. You might as well just kill yourself. You might as well, if you're anyway killing yourself, you might as well kill a few of the others, like the women, the successfully active men.
Of course, these are all terms that are closely related to the online culture wars and even the alt-right movement. Do you see a connection between incel movements and those other movements online?
One thing I found both when looking into alt-right forums, men's right activism, or incel movements was this narrative of, you need us. We will fight for you. We will let you be part of our resistance movement towards the others. A lot of this terminology is a funnel into self-harm or harm of others, which is why it's dangerous, both to them and, as we've seen historically, to those around them.
Yeah, and because this kind of, black and white thinking, just very simplistic thinking, very much lends itself to other extreme ideologies as well. Would you say that inceldom could be seen as kind of like a gateway drug into these?
I think we should distinguish between incels, which is the self-hatred, the men who are victims to their own thoughts, and then male supremacist terrorists. I think those should be two distinguished groups.
But what would you then see is the threat? Like, why are we interviewing you for this podcast from a PvE perspective? Like, what do you see is the threat that we're talking about here?
I think that there is a very natural digression from inceldom into male supremacy. Like, that is the natural conclusion to being an incel. So I think that when we talk about PvEs, like talking about outreach programs, talking about understanding the emotions without acknowledging the arguments that they make behind them is extremely important. And I think that distinguishing between these two is also understanding how the male supremacist terrorists understand themselves to be acting on behalf of the incel movement.
But on the other hand, when I'm listening to you, I just picture myself these discussions we had back in 2016 and even before that about Islamist terrorism. Also being perpetrated by a lot of lone actors, lone wolves. They also claim to speak out for the entire Muslim population of Europe, for example. So there's still some parallels there. How should we address these issues then?
There's been a societal learning period since 2001, where we have had to, as Western societies, distinguish between Muslims and terrorists. Like, even to some, that is still hard to grasp, that the very few people that have committed terrorist attacks, quote unquote, on behalf of all Muslims in the world, do not in fact act on behalf of all Muslims in the world. And I think we need to do the same with these angry men. We see the same in the incel community. When there is someone allowed to spew the propaganda of someone should do something about women, someone should take a white van and drive it into, someone should do this, someone should. Technically, on paper, it looks like a lone actor because he was sitting in his basement. He didn't have any face-to-face contact with a mastermind or a handler, but the propaganda, like this level of being intertwined into a narrative, into a group mentality, is extremely dangerous for those that are susceptible to it. And we can apply that view on Islamic terrorism, or we can apply it on white terrorism.
Movements like this, it seems quite toxic, that they're also pulling each other down, making sure that people stay in those echo chambers. It must be difficult to get out.
Exactly, and that I think is one of the main issues in this, is that how do you then leave it, and do you even want to? Of course, you want to, but you still have this like massive backing of these other men experiencing the exact same thing.
One point of the incel movement is that there are no broad exit strategies. It's, as individuals, all the incels want to get out. Like, no one wants to be there. But as a community, everybody wants to keep everybody else in there. So, like, the point of the incel movement is not to get out. It's to get deeper in. Because then there's a defense mechanism by numbers. Like, when you are challenged on your incel views, like, why are you thinking like this? You can always say, well, there's thousands of us. It's not me who's weird. It's like all of us who have seen the light, taking the red pill. So no, there is no way to get out from within.
So what would that mean going forward?
This is not a problem that's going to solve itself. It's something that needs an outside push. We should both try to solve the incel riddle or problem, to help the incels, to help those that they might harm, and to help the democratic deficit that they pose. Because in their proactive activism, when actively fighting women, we know for a fact that when attacked, especially young women withdraw from the democratic debate. So we have in the incel movement both a self-harm problem, well-being problem, violence to others problem, and a democratic problem. Like, there is a ton of reasons to not antagonize or ostracize these young men, but to a certain degree reach out and try to reintegrate them.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was super interesting talking to you.
My pleasure. This is super interesting, and I love having these like qualified discussions about it. So thank you so much for having me.
So Jordi, what did you think of Christian's points?
A lot to unpack here. I think he clearly had a passion for this topic, right? So that made it a very interesting chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's just a massive amount of terms that go with this movement, just kind of wrapping my head around those and what they all mean and how they're used is just it's quite overwhelming, actually.
And you really need to understand those words before you can actually start talking about these topics. Also, just not to stereotype entire movements. A thing to discuss even further. It is involuntary, but still, they're so involved, and they're constantly communicating about these issues, creating their own little worldviews. In the end, it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, maybe even. Exactly.
Yeah, they're just kind of feeding into that themselves as well. That kind of cycle. So it's actually quite difficult to introduce our next guest because we're meeting her anonymously to protect her identity. What I can tell you is that she works for Moonshot CVE, and she's currently mapping out and analyzing the incel movement on a global scale. Yeah, so welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself as much as you can?
Yes, I am a senior analyst at Moonshot CVE, heading up our incel work. Currently, I am delivering a project on behalf of, with funding from Public Safety Canada, to map the global incel ecosystem internationally and to understand how it manifests specifically in Canada, and then develop recommendations for the Canadian government on how to develop intervention programming for this at-risk group. And we're meeting today anonymously. Why is that? Anyone working in the area of extremism needs to be sort of conscious and aware of security and privacy concerns. But I think particularly because this is a movement that is a violent misogynistic movement. So it's a decision that sort of I've made in conjunction with my organization to make sure that I'm putting my safety first while I do this work. So I believe you wrote a guide about the language that these movements use. Can you tell us a bit more about that? I think, again, sort of all extremist movements have their own sort of ideological beliefs and sort of phrases that they use within their movement. But I think particularly with the incel movement, there's a really complex and expansive terminology that they use as a group, and that can be quite daunting and quite a barrier to entry, I think, if you're looking as a researcher in this area, or considering some of our partners who are trying to do interventions. If your area of expertise is sort of interventions with mental health, you may not have the time and the resources to actually look into all of the sort of the nuances within that particular group. So I think part of the reason that we released the guide as the first sort of part of our this project that we're doing in conjunction with public safety is to try and demystify some of that language that acts as a barrier to sort of doing work in this area. I think it's also a really important aspect in understanding the psychology behind the people who are part of this movement, because when you actually look at the sort of the language choices that they're making, particularly around how they describe women, but also in terms of how they describe themselves, sort of incels are a racially diverse group. I think sort of in the public, there's this image of them as sort of all sort of white, heterosexual, coming from a sort of Judeo-Christian background, practicing or otherwise. That's not the case. There are incels of color, there are incels of different religions, and they sort of describe themselves using those terms when they describe themselves as an incel. So it's really important in also understanding the nuances within the group as well.
There's an interesting discussion going around in the PCVE world, so to say, and that's whether to call the incel movement an extremist movement or not. And I believe Canada is a bit more eager to label them terrorist or extremists. What's your take on this?
I think absolutely they are an extremist movement. I think the sort of the goals and tactics of an extremist movement are to sort of commit violence for ideological or small p political means. Incels have an ideology. They have a belief about sort of the macro way in which the world works and the world operates, and they have a specific target, which is the class of women. So when we think about women as a class, as sort of different gender groups or racial groups, it's women as a class who are the sort of the victims and targets of this violence. But also I think it's important that this extends also to men. So incels also have sort of feelings of anger and violence towards men who are accessing sex, which they feel they're not able to access. So not only does this sort of target 50% of the population, it also targets the other 50% of the population as well. So I think, yes, absolutely, it is an extremist movement, and the ways in which violence is talked about within incel forums, the ways that it's celebrated, the way that incel killers and attackers are described with the honorific of saint or martyr, is something that we see in other extremist groups as well. And I think most importantly, I think it's really great that Canada has taken this step to label it as an extremist group, to decide to prosecute an attacker as a terrorist for sort of based on the incel movement. Because I think we've made this mistake before with the violent far right, where we've sort of allowed for the sanitization of certain narratives, and we see that with the sort of alt-right. And I think we saw the consequences of that at the beginning of this year with the attack on the Capitol building. So I think it's really important for us to take this seriously. I think it's really great that Canada has done so. And I think we need to learn from, as a sector, as a CVE sector, we should learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past and take this threats seriously before it gets worse.
Yeah, absolutely, because there are a lot of parallels that can be drawn between, for example, the far right movement and the incel movement. What kind of parallels would you draw from those two movements?
So I think there is a benefit in drawing parallels between those two movements, as I did so just there. But I think it's also important to recognize some of the differences between them. I think one sort of crossover that we see certainly within the incel movement is that there are incels who describe themselves as violent far right incels, storm incels, which stands with the prefix coming from the violent far right website Stormfront. So they really self-identify with the violent far right. They use sort of neo-Nazi imagery, and they share videos from violent far right attacks. So, for example, the Christchurch video was really celebrated within the incel community. But then again, in particular, the particular part of that video that was celebrated was a still of a woman who was sort of shot in the head as part of that video. And that is the particular still that was celebrated within the community. And there were sort of discussions that they wish that more women had been killed. So there's definitely a crossover there with the violent far right. That being said, the incel community is diverse. And the unifying identity within that community is their inceldom. So again, you see some really interesting conversations between incels who describe themselves as violent far right incels having really open, respectful conversations with incels of color about their sort of struggles with race. So it is actually quite a unifying identity in that sense. And I also think it's important to understand that when the incel ideology is talking about something that we all do on a daily basis, it's talking about sort of social interactions, it's talking about dating, it's talking about sex. There's the sort of continuum on which you move from sort of those normal practices into the sort of violent extremist practices is a lot. There's a lot more gray area in that movement than when you look at sort of the violent far right, where you're sort of thinking about sort of the neo-Nazi movement is quite distinct from the sort of the more accepted discussions that we have in society. So I think that in that case, that's why looking and working on this movement is different from the violent far right, because we have to have a lot more. We have to confront a lot more, I think, as a society about how we think about gender relations and sex and dating within ourselves, if we want to start thinking about how to do interventions at the more extreme end of it.
Thank you so much for joining us here, and best of luck with your research going forward.
That was some really, really amazing insight there from our contributor. And obviously it's so important to protect her identity if she so chooses, and it's completely understandable as well. I mean, it is scary being a woman on the internet, in general, but just talking about this stuff as well, that can kind of trigger emotions a lot with this kind of community is very difficult.
And I think it also shows the power of a movement like this, by just being afraid to expose yourself. Well, you're not doing anything wrong, right? You're just looking at what's happening online, and still that can pose a threat to your own life.
And just that there is, even though there are parallels, she was very, very adamant in kind of differentiating it as its own unique movement rather than have it linked to any other existing movement currently. Because it has been heard from our other contributors as well that it has been labeled as a very, straight white cis male who is very much in this. And it was interesting to hear from her that it's actually really not. It's, encompasses all races and backgrounds as well as, a lot of other movements would. But that was also a really interesting distinction to hear from her.
So our next and final guest of today is going to help us understand what we as practitioners can do and what kind of things we need to take into consideration while working on these topics. So Fabian Wichmann works for Exit Germany. This is an organization that helps people to leave the violent far-right scenes over there.
Fabian, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Yeah, normally I work for Exit Germany. So my main job is to counsel people who want to leave the far-right scene. And on top, I do campaigning or public relations for Exit.
We are told that you are somewhat of an expert on this. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of work you do, but also just what is your experience with incels and violent inceldom?
From time to time, we have cases in right-wing extremist terrorism or prepared for terrorism in connection to the incel movement. So people who came from that incel movement and later moved to right-wing extremist or terrorist narratives because of this strong connection between some incel narratives and some far-right narratives.
The internet is creating this like echo chamber in which you can kind of voice your own opinions without being filtered, and with, you know, people telling you that, yeah, you're absolutely right about this, like this is exactly what I'm feeling as well. They only use nicknames, that they don't use their real faces, they don't use their own names. Like, do you see that as a potential opportunity for, say, far-right extremists who kind of share this kind of similar ideology to come in there and then kind of take advantage of these vulnerable young men?
Some will do, because the dispositions that these people have in their bag are quite good for recruiting. So you have people with problems, you could provide them goals, you could provide them an identity of a group, you could provide them a solution. And that's quite interesting for these recruiters out of the far right to do so.
Because the whole in-group, out-group thing is not just related to extremism. You know, we all have our in-group, we all have our out-group, but it's when you see that out-group as a threat and actually try to kind of eliminate it or see it as something that you need to attack violently, this is when obviously it becomes an issue. But because, at least to my understanding, this whole in-group mentality is so strong for incels, what do you think about like intervention, for example? Like how could it be possible for someone from this out-group to potentially come in and intervene, and how useful do you think that would be?
But I think it's quite hard to intervene in that special environment. So they have their in-group, and I think everybody who tried to intervene there will lose.
So I was thinking about incels over the past couple of days, and I think also high school shooters, they kind of share those same ideas, those same elements, right? They don't feel part of their schools, they might be bullied in a way, and then reaching for a weapon might seem to be the solution somehow. We know that high school shooters are quite a big problem in America. So how big of a threat would you call this incel ideology or incel movement?
There's a problem. There is some kind of youth. There are some guys with a problem, and if we don't solve the problem on an individual level in schools or in other surroundings, like connected with bullying or whatever, then we don't solve the problem. So if we only send someone into these groups, I think there is a lot of time lost to intervene, because from that point they're very quite integrated in that kind of community. They have quite clear pictures and narratives why they are there, and I think it's quite hard to handle it from that point. So we have to go much more onto the beginning in schools, in youth clubs, with social workers, and work with them with their problems.
I work with youth workers, and they've expressed to us that they have had a lot of these cases where there are young men who identify as incels, and are actually, you know, have had to be reported to the police because they are planning something violent. So yeah, it is definitely becoming a much bigger issue. What advice would you have for practitioners in you know, fitting inceldom and incels into their practice, and what advice can you give us in how to take this forward?
There's a need to find different ways also for youth workers and schools to find a new connection to youth and their problems. To think about how we could combine on and offline a little bit more, also in their daily life of schools or youth workers. There's a lot to do in the early intervention. But also on different levels in the actual situation. So on a political level, on a social level, on a community level, on technical levels, like also the providers of such forums or the providers of social media apps and all that stuff. They have also a responsibility to deal with this kind of topics.
I think that's quite interesting. You need youth workers, you need people to reach out to these individuals instead of looking online, instead of looking to these communities, and maybe that's something what we kind of tend to do as practitioners, right? We see a problem online, so we look online instead of trying to address those issues from an offline perspective.
I think that's the biggest issue to think about the next years.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was super interesting to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fabian.
It was a pleasure for me too.
So that was an interesting chat, I must say. I think he was spot on when he talked about offline interventions for online issues.
Yeah, absolutely, and that also spoke to me personally a lot, because that is kind of what my whole project does, is that we have these youth workers who we train on these different issues that are going on, not just online. We're training youth workers to kind of deal with this in an offline manner. So yeah, to me especially, that was just a very, very, very good point here to kind of drive home, in that we need both interventions for something to actually work and have an impact on this.
Well, I think all of our contributors today had a very clear but also different perspective on it. What do you think, Vera?
There is so much here. We really don't know that much about it yet, because for a lot of us, this movement is very invisible, and it is to a lot of people who try to prevent, this kind of violence.
What for me really stands out is that from a practitioner's perspective, maybe we also stereotype a movement like this, and then we forget that these are actually young men with really real or very real grievances and real issues, and that we should address those things as well. So instead of looking to these online spaces where they meet, where they communicate, we should also think about that there are actually people behind those computer screens, right? And that we need offline action and maybe change education. We need to look at youth work, but also have maybe some conversations on a societal level.
It's definitely a conversation that is imminently needed.
You've been listening to RAN in Focus, a podcast brought to you by the Radicalization Awareness Network. Feel free to like, share, or subscribe. And if you have any comments, you can put them probably somewhere below.
Thank you so much for tuning in.
Goodbye.
Bye.